Did you know there's a mountain in New Hampshire that holds the record for the fastest wind speed ever directly measured by a human being? A gust so violent, the observer went outside into 150-mile-per-hour winds just to fix the instrument measuring it? Or that a small patch of land in the northern corner of the state once declared itself an independent republic, issued its own stamps, and raised its own militia before anyone in Washington noticed? How about the fact that the state's entire coastline is 18 miles long, shorter than some city beaches, yet its biggest take has a shoreline of 288 miles? Well, there's a lot more to the Granite State than most people realize, and if I had to guess, you're about to find that out. Today we're breaking down the 50 facts that will completely change the way you look at it. Let's dive in. Fact 50. New Hampshire's most famous landmark collapsed overnight and nobody saw it happen. On the evening of May 2nd, 2003, the Old Man of the Mountain, a 40-foot granite profile jutting from the side of Cannon Mountain in Franconia Notch, was right where it had always been. By the next morning, it was gone. 5 ledges that freeze-thaw erosion had spent thousands of years shaping into a perfect human profile had finally given way and tumbled down the cliff. Steel rods and turnbuckles had been bolted in since 1916 to hold it all together, but the rock beneath them crumbled away. The Old Man still appears on the state quarter, the old license plate, and 100 road signs. The face of a place that no longer has the face. Fact 49. The face was formed by complete accident. The Old Man wasn't sculpted or shaped by some deliberate natural process. It was the random result of water freezing and thawing in 5 separate crack systems in Jurassic Conway granite over thousands of years, producing ledges that only look like a face from one specific angle at the north end of the valley below. Change your vantage point by 50 yards in any direction, and it was just a bunch of rocks. The entire mythology of live free or die as a geographic identity was built on a geological coincidence visible only from a specific stretch of highway. Fact 48. The motto, live free or die, wasn't written for the state. It was written for a toast at a dinner the author couldn't attend. In 1809, the Revolutionary War hero General John Stark was too sick to travel to a reunion of veterans from the 1777 Battle of Bennington in Vermont. So, he sent a letter instead, with a toast for them to read aloud. Live free or die. Death is not the worst of evils. The state didn't officially adopt it as the motto until 1945, 136 years after Stark wrote it and 23 years after he died. The other finalists that year, in case you were curious, were Strong and Steadfast as Our Granite Hills and Pioneers Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow. New Hampshire made the right call. Fact 47. New Hampshire holds the northern and western hemisphere record for fastest wind speed ever measured directly by a human. On April 12, 1934, observers at the Mount Washington Observatory clocked 2 wind gusts at 231 miles per hour. The world record stood for 62 years until an automated instrument on a remote Australian island measured 253 miles per hour during a typhoon in 1996, but that was a machine. Mount Washington's 231 miles per hour is still the fastest surface wind speed ever recorded at a staffed weather station, observed in person by actual people who had to go outside into 150-mile-per-hour winds first just to unfreeze the anemometer before they could get an accurate reading. Fact 46. Mount Washington has hurricane-force winds over 100 days a year. The peak sits at only 6,288 feet, barely a foothold by Western standards. But it sits exactly at the confluence of several major storm tracks, and its shape acts like a funnel for wind. The average wind speed at the summit is 35 miles per hour. The record low temperature recorded there was minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit in 1885. The summit is covered in fog, roughly a third of the year. The observatory that sits on top proudly calls itself the home of the world's worst weather, and they're not exaggerating. Fact 45. A man nearly died hiking up that mountain, and his response was to build the first mountain railway in the world. Sylvester March got caught in a storm climbing Mount Washington in the early 1850s and barely survived. He decided the solution was a rack and pinion cog railway, where toothed wheel grips, a central rail, to haul trains up grades steep enough to flip any conventional locomotive. The New Hampshire legislature thought this was so absurd, they reportedly added an amendment to his charter giving him permission to extend it to the moon. The Mount Washington Cog Railway opened in 1869 anyway, became the first mountain climbing railway of the world, and has been running continuously ever since. The original locomotive was named Old Pepper Sass because someone in the crowd said it looked like a pepper sauce bottle. Fact 44. The White Mountains have 48 peaks over 4,000 feet, and thousands of people spend years trying to hike all of them. The list was formalized in 1958 by the Appalachian Mountain Club. And completed all 48. The New Hampshire 4,000-footers has become a rite of passage for serious hikers across the Northeast. Over 15,000 people have done it. Some have done it in winter. Some have done it multiple times. One of the peaks, Mount Tecumseh, might not even qualify. A cartographer estimated it lands at 3,995 feet, 5 feet shorter of the threshold, but it's been grandfathered in anyway. Fact 43. All 9 of the presidential range's major peaks are named after American presidents, and they were assigned their names in a single afternoon. In the summer of 1820, a party from Lancaster, New Hampshire, set out to explore the range. When they reached the summit of what would become Mount Washington, already named by then, they started assigning surrounding peaks to presidents in order of height: Adams, Jefferson, Monroe, Madison, and so on down the line. They finished in an afternoon. The only glitch was a surveying error that made Mount Monroe, named for the 5th president, 22 feet shorter than Mount Madison, named for the 4th, out of order with the ranking the system was supposed to follow. Fact 42. The original name of Mount Washington Summit was given by Abenaki people, and it means home of the Great Spirit. The Abenaki called it Agiokochuk, a name that predates every surveyor, presidential ranger naming party, and cog railway locomotive by thousands of years. The peak was considered sacred and dangerous ground, the dwelling place of the storm god Pamola. Indigenous guides on early European expeditions to the summit often declined to reach the top for exactly that reason. Fact 41. The AMC built the first mountain hiking hut in the United States in 1888, and it's still there. The Appalachian Mountain Club placed Madison Spring Hut in the col between Mount Madison and Adams in 1888, and it has begun serving overnight hikers ever since, the oldest mountain hut in the country. Today, there are 8 AMC huts spread across 54 miles of the White Mountains along the Appalachian Trail, each about a day's hike apart, each accessible only by foot. Every morning, the crew, young seasonal workers who live at elevation, bakes fresh bread and cooks dinner from scratch. It takes 11,000 pounds of flour a year just to keep the system running. Fact 40. Lake Winnipesaukee has 365 islands, or 258 or 274, depending entirely on who you ask. The lake covers 71 square miles with 288 miles of shoreline and at least 258 confirmed islands. But the number climbs or drops depending on whether you count exposed ledges, seasonal sandbars, and tidal variations in the water level. The exact island tally has been debated for decades, and the only thing everyone agrees on is that it's somewhere between a lot and more than you expect. The smallest is Becky's Island, which is about 10 feet wide. Fact 39. Winnipesaukee is the oldest summer resort in the United States. Governor John Wentworth built a summer home here in the mid-1700s, establishing what historians recognize as the first resort town in America, nearly 250 years before Lake House became a lifestyle brand. The tradition of retreating to the lake has been unbroken ever since. Fact 38. New Hampshire owns the entire Connecticut River. The Connecticut River forms the entire western border between New Hampshire and Vermont for about 255 miles. Most people assume the border runs down the middle of the river, the way most river borders work. It doesn't. The border follows the low water mark on the Vermont side, meaning New Hampshire owns the whole riverbed from bank to bank. Vermont tried to dispute this in 1915 and sued in the U.S. Supreme Court. The court ruled in 1933 that Vermont had relinquished its claim to the river back in 1782, when it renounced jurisdiction over a group of New Hampshire towns that had briefly tried to join the Vermont Republic. New Hampshire got the river. Vermont got the rebuff. Fact 37. The Connecticut River originates 300 yards south of the Canadian border, inside New Hampshire. Fourth Connecticut Lake, a small pond near the town of Pittsburgh, sits just 300 yards from the U.S.-Canada boundary, the most northerly point in New Hampshire. From there, the river runs 410 miles south through 4 states before emptying into Long Island Sound. The entire Connecticut River system traces back to what is essentially a puddle near the Canadian line in northern New Hampshire. Fact 36. The northernmost town in New Hampshire is also the largest town by land area in all of New England. Pittsburgh covers 291 square miles, bigger than any other town in all 6 New England states, and it has a population of around 850 people. That's roughly 1 person per third of a square mile. It is also the only New Hampshire municipality that borders Canada, the only one that borders both Maine and Vermont, and the only one to contain land west of the Connecticut River. Fact 35. The same town was its own independent republic for 3 years. From 1832 to 1835, the roughly 300 residents of what would become Pittsburgh declared themselves the Republic of the Indian Stream, wrote a constitution, established a bicameral legislature and court system, raised a 41-man militia, and issued their own stamps. The reason? A vague line in the Treaty of Paris meant that they were simultaneously being taxed by both the United States and Canada and effectively protected by neither. A miniature war broke out in 1835 when the Republic's land agent was arrested in Canada. The New Hampshire militia arrived shortly after, and the Republic surrendered. The Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842 eventually settled the boundary and confirmed the territory as American soil. Fact 34. 9 small islands of the New Hampshire coast are split between 2 states. The Isles of Shoals sit about 6 miles off the coast of Portsmouth, and the state border between New Hampshire and Maine runs right through the middle of them. 4 islands, Star, White, Lunging, and Seabays, belong to New Hampshire. 5, Appledore, Smutty Nose, Malaga, Cedar, and Duck belong to Maine. In the 17th century, colonists on the Maine side of the island literally picked up and moved to Star Island to avoid higher Maine taxes. They founded the township of Gosport there in 1715. You can still cross between the 2 states by boat in the middle of the ocean, 6 miles from shore. Fact 33. New Hampshire has the shortest ocean coastline of any coastal state in the entire country. 18 miles. That's it. Maine, which shares a land border with New Hampshire to the north, has 3,478 miles of tidal shoreline. New Hampshire has 18. The whole stretch runs from the Massachusetts line to the Maine line and fits inside 6 towns: Seabrook, Hampton, Northampton, Rye, Newcastle, and Portsmouth, all of which together could fill a single mid-sized county anywhere else on the seaboard. Fact 32. New Hampshire is the only state in the entire country with no general income tax and no general sales tax simultaneously. The state last eliminated its interest and dividends tax as of January 2025, completing a journey to zero income tax of any kind. There is also no sales tax, the only state in the continental U.S. where both are true. The trade-off is some of the highest property taxes in the country. Property is essentially the primary tax base. But for high earners who rent or own modestly, New Hampshire is one of the most tax-efficient places in the nation to live. Fact 31. The state has had a law in the books since 1975 that legally obligates New Hampshire to hold its presidential primary before any other state. The law requires the Secretary of State to schedule the primary at least 7 days before any similar election anywhere else in the country. It's not tradition, it's statute. A state has held the first in-the-nation presidential primary since 1920, when a scheduling coincidence bumped it ahead of every other state. The law was passed afterwards to make sure that never changed. Incumbent President Harry Truman lost the Democratic primary here in 1952 and decided not to seek re-election. New Hampshire has been making and breaking presidencies ever since. Fact 30. The Flume Gorge is an 800-foot-long chasm with walls 90 feet tall that are just 12 feet apart, and it was carved by a basalt dike, not a glacier. Franconia Notch hides one of the stranger geological features in the Northeast. Millions of years ago, molten basalt intruded as a dike through the existing Conway granite, then cooled and hardened. Because basalt erodes faster than granite, water slowly dissolved the softer rock and left a narrow slot canyon in its place. The glacier that covered the region later didn't shape the flume. It just stripped away the surface material and left the gorge exposed. Fact 29. Franconia Notch, Crawford Notch, and Pickham Notch are all glacially carved U-shaped valleys, and all three were cut by the same ice sheet. The Laurentide ice sheet covered New Hampshire under a mile of ice and physically deepened the widened and existing river valleys into the broad, steep-sided passes we see today. It then dragged boulders the size of houses and dropped them at random across the forest floor, where some still sit today. An 800-ton erratic is just a boulder that woke up in a completely different part of the continent from where it started. Fact 28. The White Mountains formed during the Mesozoic era, 100 to 124 million years ago, making them younger than the surrounding Appalachians by hundreds of millions of years. The broader Appalachian bedrock dates back over 400 million years, but the White Mountains themselves formed from a distinct volcanic intrusion during the Mesozoic while dinosaurs were still alive. The granite that came up through the crust at that point now makes up the peaks. They may once have been as tall as the Alps before erosion wore them down. Fact 27. New Hampshire has an alpine zone, Arctic-like tundra on exposed mountain ridges that begins where the trees stop. Above roughly 4,800 feet, the climate on New Hampshire's high ridges becomes so cold and wind-blasted that trees can't survive. The plants that replace them, lichens, sedges, tiny mountain flowers, are species normally found in the Arctic, hundreds of miles north. The Appalachian Trail crosses the zone across the Presidential Range and Franconia Ridge. On a bad day in January up there, it is indistinguishable from the surface of an Arctic tundra. Fact 26. The state is called the Granite State for geological, historical, and economic reasons that all overlap. New Hampshire's bedrock is overwhelmingly granite. The material that gave rise to the quarry industry that helped build 19th century New England, Concord granite, quarried from the capital region, went into state capitals, post offices, and public monuments across the country. The Old Man of the Mountain was also made of granite, a specific type called Conway granite, named for the town in the White Mountains. The nickname captures something real about the place: hard, durable, and built from the ground up. Fact 25. Dartmouth College sits on the New Hampshire bank of the Connecticut River and technically could have been built in Vermont or even further upstate. When Eliezer Wheelock obtained a royal charter for Dartmouth in 1769, towns across the Connecticut River Valley started bidding for the school. Haverhill offered 5,000 acres. Orford offered 2,100 acres plus labor. The village of Hanover won with 3,000 contiguous acres. Had Wheelock accepted a different offer, the northernmost Ivy League university might be in Vermont, or at least somewhere else entirely in New Hampshire. Fact 24. Dartmouth holds the distinction of being the northernmost Ivy League university in the country. Its campus sites in Hanover, about as far north as you can go and still call yourself a major research university in the contiguous 48. Founded in 1769, it's also the 9th oldest college in the United States, one of 9 colonial colleges founded before the American Revolution. All of this happened in a state that was still mostly wilderness at the time. Fact 23. New Hampshire has some of the highest concentration of named mountain summits in the entire Northeast. The White Mountains contain 48 4,000-footers, more than any other state in New England by a wide margin. Maine has 14, Vermont has 5. They also contain over 1,200 miles of hiking trails and about 100 miles of the Appalachian Trail. In peak bagging circles, the sport of systematically hiking every summit on the list, the North Hampshire 48 is essentially the gateway drug. Fact 22. The Abenaki, named for New Hampshire's highest peak, means home of the Great Spirit, but the mountain was named after a president who never visited it. George Washington died in 1799. Mount Washington was formerly named sometime in the 1790s. Washington never set foot in the White Mountains. The name choice reflects a national naming fever for anything and everything after the first president, not any personal connection. The mountain holds his name permanently, despite the fact that neither he nor anyone representing him ever got within 200 miles of it. Fact 21. New Hampshire's lowest point is sea level, and it barely touches the sea. With only 18 miles of coastline, New Hampshire is the only coastal state in the continental U.S. that can make that claim. Its highest point is Mount Washington at 6,288 feet, making the state's total elevation range from 0 to 6,288 feet, a more dramatic spread than several larger and more mountainous-looking states achieve. Fact 20. New Hampshire's all-time temperature records span a 156-degree range. The all-time high was 106 degrees Fahrenheit, recorded in Nashua on July 4, 1911. The all-time low was minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit, recorded on Mount Washington on January 22, 1885. A 156-degree total swing. The gap between a comfortable room temperature and boiling water is only 142 degrees. Fact 19. Mount Washington's summit has an average annual temperature of 27 degrees Fahrenheit, colder than nearly anywhere else in the Northeast. The surrounding valley stations at similar elevation average 40 to 42 degrees Fahrenheit. Washington's summit averages 27 degrees Fahrenheit, a gap caused by the wind, which strips heat from every surface continuously. Rime ice builds up on the observatory buildings to thicknesses of several feet each winter. Removing it is part of the staff's regular job. Fact 18. Coastkantee is the largest county in the state and one of the most sparsely populated counties east of the Mississippi. Coos County covers 1,800 square miles, nearly a quarter of the entire state, and holds only about 30,000 people. That's less than 17 people per square mile, in a state already known for being rural. The county contains Pittsburgh, the largest town in New England, with 800 residents spread across 291 square miles. Fact 17. New Hampshire is the only state that has physically owned every part of a major interstate river. By virtue of the 1933 Supreme Court ruling, New Hampshire not only borders the Connecticut River, it owns it, from the Vermont shore to the New Hampshire shore for 255 miles. Vermont cannot fish it, dam it, or bridge it without dealing with New Hampshire's jurisdiction. This has created some interesting legal situations in the decades since the dams went in and flooded the original low water mark to which the ruling referred. Fact 16. The primary reason New Hampshire's presidential primary became permanent was a scheduling coincidence in 1920. Indiana moved its primary to May that year. New Hampshire's, which had been on the same day as traditional town meetings in March, then happened to fall first. The state legislature noticed, liked it, and kept it that way. What started as a quirk of Indiana's calendar became, 106 years later, a legally protected institution that has shaped every presidential race since. Fact 15. New Hampshire's state border with Maine extends 6 miles into the ocean. The land border between New Hampshire and Maine ends at the coast and continues as a maritime boundary out to the Isle of Shoals, where it divides the island group between the two states before continuing offshore. You can trace the exact line from a point on the Portsmouth waterfront all the way to open ocean. Fact 14. The Republic of Indian Stream raised its own militia, built its own courts, and issued its own stamps, and only surrendered because Canada arrested one of its leaders. When a leader of the Republic was seized in Canada in 1835, the Republic's citizens launched a retaliatory cross-border raid to free him. That escalated into more incidents. New Hampshire's governor sent in the militia. The Republic voted to accept New Hampshire's jurisdiction rather than keep fighting on two fronts. The whole episode lasted 3 years, involved no more than a few hundred people, and ended with the area becoming the town of Pittsburgh in 1840. The boundary it fought over wasn't definitely settled until 1842. Fact 13. New Hampshire has only one Canadian border crossing, and it's at the very tip of the state. At the northern terminus of U.S. Route 3 in Pittsburgh, a single-staffed border crossing connects New Hampshire to the Canadian province of Quebec. It's the only point where a road crosses from New Hampshire directly into Canada. To get there from the rest of New Hampshire, you drive through about 100 miles of wilderness. Fact 12. The Presidential Traverse, hiking all 7 major presidential summits in a single push, covers 23 miles and nearly 9,000 feet of elevation gain. It's considered one of the most demanding single-day hikes in the Northeast. Done above treeline for most of its length and fully exposed to whatever Mount Washington's weather decides to deliver, the record for fastest known time on the traverse keeps getting broken. But the casual version takes most strong hikers 10 to 14 hours and leaves nothing left for the drive home. Fact 11. New Hampshire invented the ski industry in America. The first rope tow in the U.S. was strung up in Woodstock, New Hampshire, in 1934, powered by a car engine. Cranmore Mountain in North Conway opened one of the first modern ski areas in 1938. Dartmouth's outing club was building downhill trails in the 1920s, years before most of the country knew alpine skiing existed. New Hampshire essentially exported winter recreation to the rest of America. Fact 10. The word notch is used for mountain passes in New Hampshire and almost nowhere else in the English-speaking world. Franconia Notch, Crawford Notch, Pickham Notch, Kinsman's Notch, Dixville Notch. The White Mountains have more notches than most places have mountains. The word refers to the U-shaped glacial caps between peaks. In the rest of the country, the same geographical feature is called a pass, gap, or col. New Hampshire kept notch as a local term that has become synonymous with the region itself. Fact 9. Dixville Notch has voted at midnight in every presidential election since 1960 and is always the first results of the night. A handful of voters in the tiny, unincorporated community of Dixville Notch has been voting at the stroke of midnight on Election Day for over 6 decades, producing the night's first official results within minutes of the polls opening. The tradition started in 1960. The community has never had more than a few dozen registered voters, and some years the entire vote is counted before the Eastern Seaboard has even opened its regular polling places. Fact 8. New Hampshire's state motto is the only one in America that includes a threat. Live free or die is not an aspiration or a description. It is a declaration with a specific implied ultimatum. Most state mottos, Eureka, Virtue, Liberty, and Independence, North to the Future, describe things the state has or believes in. New Hampshire draws a line and says what happens if someone crosses it. The general sentiment was borrowed from the French Revolution, but made famous by a man from New Hampshire who sent it in a letter from his sickbed. Fact 7. New Hampshire was part of Massachusetts for almost 200 years. The state was established as a separate province in 1679 and kept being reabsorbed into Massachusetts periodically until 1741, when a royal commission finally drew a permanent line. New Hampshire didn't officially become a state until 1776, making it one of the first since it adopted its own constitution in January of that year, 6 months before the Declaration of Independence was signed. Fact 6. The Connecticut River begins inside New Hampshire and ends in Connecticut, passing through Vermont, Massachusetts, and Connecticut in between. The river's headwaters at 4th Connecticut Lake in Pittsburgh sit 300 yards from Canada. From there, it travels 407 miles south, forms the New Hampshire-Vermont border for 255 of those miles, then cuts through the hearts of Massachusetts and Connecticut before reaching Long Island Sound. The longest river in New England begins and ends in the states that share its name, but runs through 2 others in between. Fact 5. New Hampshire's biggest natural lake has an Abenaki name that means roughly Smile of the Great Spirit. Winnipesaukee however you trace the etymology, is one of the longest and most recognizable place names in New England. The lake itself is the third largest in the region. Frozen every January, ice out declared officially when the steamship MS Mount Washington can cross its entire length without hitting ice. Records of the ice out date go back to 1887. Fact 4. New Hampshire was the first state to declare independence from Great Britain, 6 months before the Declaration of Independence. In January 1776, New Hampshire adopted its own state constitution, effectively declaring itself a self-governing republic independent of British authority. The Declaration of Independence came in July. New Hampshire didn't wait for the rest of the country to catch up. Fact 3. The Appalachian Trail passes through New Hampshire for about 160 miles, and hikers widely consider it the most physically brutal stretch of the entire 2,200-mile trail. The section above treeline on the Presidential Range offers no shelter, no protection from wind, and exposure to weather that has killed experienced hikers in every month of the year. Tents and sleeping bags provide little insulation against Mount Washington's scale wind events. Through hikers who have walked from Georgia to New Hampshire report that the whites feel like a different category of difficulty from everything south of them. Fact 2. New Hampshire's temperature swing between its all-time high and all-time low is 156 degrees, and the coldest of those records was set on the same mountain that holds the wind speed record. Mount Washington's minus 50 degree Fahrenheit in January of 1885, paired with Nashaw's 106 degree Fahrenheit in July of 1911, gives the state a documented thermal range wider than the difference between room temperature and boiling water. Both extremes set records that still stand. Both were in New Hampshire. Neither should surprise anyone who has spent time here. Fact 1. Almost every extreme geographic fact about New Hampshire traces back to the same two forces, glaciers and granite. The notches were carved by ice. The lake basins were gouged out by ice. The boulders stranded in the forest were carried by ice. The rounded ridges of the White Mountains were smoothed by ice. And underneath all of it, shaping everything the ice had to work with, was granite, an intrusive, indigenous rock so hard it resists erosion over hundreds and millions of years, accumulates at the surface, and eventually becomes the state's defining feature. Its nickname, its building material, its face on the mountain, and its metaphor for everything its people believe about themselves. New Hampshire didn't choose to be the Granite State. The geology just kept insisting until everyone agreed.